Good morning and welcome to the Seafaring Channel. I'm Robert Wilkins, Chief Program Officer for Seafarers Ministry of the Golden Gate and the Executive Director of the International Maritime Center here in Oakland. We are an ecumenical alliance for maritime welfare and community connectedness. Through our member organizations, we offer practical and emotional support as well as spiritual guidance to seafarers while they are on ship, as well as welcome and hospitality to seafarers when they are on land here in our ports in the Bay Area. Our services include counseling and guidance, meals, transportation, recreation, internet communications, and SIM cards for international communication, and many more services. We also engage in global advocacy on behalf of seafarers for human rights, safety, and their economic well-being. We connect maritime and community through programs like this that inform the broader community about maritime matters and why they actually do matter. And we also host community activities at our Maritime Center located in Portview Park at the Port of Oakland in Oakland, California. We thank all of you for joining us today for Maritime Culture Currents, an education initiative designed to explore the past and present connections between various cultures and the maritime environment. Yesterday, we observed the International Day for Women in Maritime with a marvelous guest, Dr. Elizabeth McNee of the California Maritime Academy. Today, we will explore another dimension of maritime thought and take a look at the same time at a little bit of African American heritage and culture as it relates to the maritime environment. And today we have an equally outstanding, esteemed guest who I'll introduce in just a few seconds. But first, I'll remind us that water covers 71% of the Earth's surface. 97% of that water is found in oceans as salt water. The ocean is home to 228,450 different species, and as many as 2 million more that remain a total mystery to everyone. The ocean supplies half of our oxygen. The ocean provides lots of food and much more than just seafood. Ingredients from the sea are found in many foods such as peanut butter and soy milk. Many medicines that help to fight cancer, arthritis, Alzheimer's disease, and heart disease contain ingredients from the ocean. Truly, the ocean is our planet's life support system. But water is not only a natural treasure, it also is a means of transport, recreation, and economic activity. Water has always and will continue to play a prominent role in the social and cultural lives of people all over the globe. It looms large, especially in the spiritual foundations and practices of cultures across time and distance. Our topic today is the spiritual meaning of water in African American maritime history. Our guest is well qualified to guide us on this subject. Dr. Kevin Dawson is an assistant professor of history in the School of Social Sciences, Humanities, and Arts at UC Merced, University of California at Merced. He's an associate professor of history there. He received his PhD from the University of South Carolina. He has been a Ford Dissertation Fellow in the early 2000s, and his article, Enslaved Swimmers and Divers in the Atlantic Whirl, received the 2005 Louis Pelzer Memorial Award from the Organization of American Historians. He publishes frequently in this area. His research and teaching interests include the history of the Atlantic world, early American history, African diaspora, and the African American history. Without any further ado, I am going to welcome to our webcast this morning, Dr. Kevin Dawson. Good morning, Kevin, and thank you for being here.
Hi, thank you, Robert. I really appreciate that introduction and the overview of your program and everything that you're helping to provide. It was very insightful. And so I want to talk today about how enslaved Africans recreated and reimagined African traditions in the Americas, because we oftentimes don't think about Africans as having a maritime past, or even maybe African Americans having a rich maritime past that goes all the way back to early America in the 1600s. Now, I want to start off by saying that slavery is often this kind of contentious issue, well, for African Americans and for white Americans. And that there's negative perceptions and people oftentimes don't want to talk about it, that members of both communities might feel ashamed about this chapter of our past. I think it's important to understand African American maritime history, African American history, even that of enslaved people, because it demonstrates, I think, really the resilience of African Americans. I mean, for many African Americans, we might see slavery as a stigma, but because of the conditions that enslaved people endured, they sought to recreate and reimagine African traditions as a way of providing themselves with a sense of community, of belonging, and a sense of purpose. And then also these cultural traditions that Africans in America retained was really a way of cultural, a form of, you might argue, cultural resistance, in saying that despite the conditions that enslaved people were being subjected to, and despite the pressures of Americanizing, they were going to maintain their ethnic traditions. And so today I'm going to talk about some of these ethnic traditions, some of these. I'm actually not going to be able to get into many of the specific ethnic traditions, but instead I'll speak more broadly about the shared beliefs about water that Africans had and the shared cultural practices that they had, and then their ability to transmit those traditions to the Americas, and then also to the United States. Now, I want to start off with an anecdote of enslaved women swimming at a Jamaican beach that illustrates how captives used swimming to challenge their circumstances. And importantly, enslaved women were the most subjugated and dispossessed people in the Americas at that time, right? They had their gender, being women working against them, the race, and also their social status as enslaved people. And yet women were able to use water to resist exploitation. And so enslaved women understood how white men objectified their bodies, knowing that rape could be a cruel rite of passage into womanhood. On land, women's ability to escape sexual exploitation was limited. Conversely, water and aquatics permitted women to thwart male aggression. As Englishman Cedric Williams and a group of non-swimming male companions toured Jamaica in 1823, they paused to covetously watch 20 nude African-born women as they recreated African traditions with, quote, some washing clothes, some washing themselves, while others swam about like nereids, end quote. When the voyeurs were discovered, the women, quote, on shore dashed into the water. When they were far enough from our masculine gaze, they popped their heads above water and laughed and made fun of us, end quote. Emboldened by the men's inability to swim, the women flaunted their sexuality, alluring the men to swim out to fulfill their sexual cravings. They seductively glided through waters that silhouetted their nude bodies, distorting the intimate details as they provocatively sang about a white preacher who, quote, crossed the sea to make love, end quote, to slave women. Williams thinly veiled his desires, dubbing the song composer for Serapine, who was a Greek goddess raped by Hades. For the femme fatales, Jamaican waters were an empowering sanctuary encompassed by the cruelties of plantation slavery. Here they retained control of their nude bodies, even as men a few feet away sought to sexually dominate them. Water, as Robert talked about, illustrates human experiences throughout much of Atlantic Africa, where most people lived near water. Stretching from Angola to Senegal, Atlantic Africa is rimmed by thousands of miles of coastline, bisected by rivers and streams that water the roots of silk cottonwood trees that were carved into dugout canoes. Here, Africans formed intimate relationships with water during work and personal time, regarding it as a social and cultural space. Societies were not dichotomized into discrete terrestrial or maritime worlds. Instead, people equally understood land and water, perceiving their environments as waterscapes that seamlessly merged freshwater, saltwater, and land into social and cultural spaces. Many Africans were fishing farmers and farming fishermen who fished one season and farmed another, using dugout canoes to transport goods to markets, weaving terrestrial and aquatic expertise into amphibious lives, interlacing spiritual and secular beliefs, economies, social structures, political institutions, their very way of life around relationships with water. Dugout canoes illustrate the spiritual, social, and cultural values that Atlantic Africans affixed to water and how they combined maritime and terrestrial experiences. They embodied and expressed generational wisdom and were ingrained with social, cultural, spiritual, and political meaning. They were companions and collaborators and community members, transporting canoeists safely across liquid expanses, returning them home with fish and incomes. Throughout Atlantic Africa, canoe making was widely deemed a sacred profession, with dugouts treated as sacred and secular objects, reflected in the Senegambian proverb, "The blood of kings and the tears of canoe makers are sacred things that must not touch the ground." A canoe's value was not solely determined by the construction cost, it was determined by its ability to produce incomes, safeguard mariners' lives, and embody and articulate community valuations. Spiritual motifs carved in high and low relief, along with elaborate figureheads, articulated canoes' relationship with water and spirits residing therein, affording spiritual guidance to canoeists in quest of fish, markets, and safe passages. Cottonwood trees coupled the here and now to the spiritual world. Over 100 feet tall, they had a soul and connected the heavens, earth, and water. Their spreading buttress roots embraced, their spreading buttresses and buttress roots embraced the earth, while their branches embraced the sky. Their trunks house the soul of generations waiting to be born, as Nigerian author Chinua Achebe expressed in his fictional representation of Igbo life. Thus, members of many African-descended communities on both sides of the Atlantic performed spiritual ceremonies under the embrace of their spreading canopies. Canoes had a gender that determined how they rowed, while the soul of the trees that dugouts were carved from continued to reside in their hull. Canoe women and men formed personal and spiritual bonds with dugouts. Canoemen performed welcoming ceremonies that included placing food offerings in the bow of their newly purchased canoe and calling them bride to symbolize the symbiotic relationship that they shared. Honors continued throughout a canoe's life, with well-treated canoes guiding fisherwomen and men to schools of fish, telling them when to cast nets, and helped merchants evade pirates. Water was a sacred space populated by deities and spirits, with members of many ethnic groups believing the realm of the dead lay at the bottom of or across the ocean or a large river, lake, or lagoon. Water channeled one's soul across the Kalanga, and the Kalanga was this liminal, permeable divide between the living and the dead. And so water channeled one's soul across the Kalanga to the supernatural world, where it was reunited with ancestors waiting to be reborn. To facilitate this journey, members of many communities buried their dead with a small canoe. Swimming incorporated water into many Africans' daily life, allowing societies to create immersionary cultures that valued water. Transforming water into a surreal element, swimming allowed African-descended people to take pleasure in their weightless bodies while gliding through liquid infinities as body, mind, and soul slipped into fluid motion. Africans treated swimming as a life skill and method of personal cleanliness, devising efficient techniques to traverse surface and submarine strata. Sources indicate that many mothers taught their children to swim after they learned to walk at about 10 to 14 months old, or after they were weaned at approximately 2 to 3 years of age. After teaching children the fundamentals, including the breaststroke, backstroke, side stroke, and crawl or freestyle, parents promoted expertise through water play. Boawi Brinch, who was raised along the Niger River in what's now Mali, explained that the Bobo people held swimming in high regard, while his, quote, father and mother delighted in my vivacity and agility, end quote. Many societies affix spirituality to gliding through this potentially deadly element, creating charms to safeguard against drowning and marine creatures, with Brinch's father giving him a protective ornament. Safeguarded by prowess, amulets, and buddy systems, parents encouraged children to explore their liquid worlds. Many coastal children began to play with the sea, learning to swim and learning to surf when roughly 5 years old, transforming turbulence into thrilling playgrounds. Youth learned about surf zones by seeing and feeling how the ocean pulled and pushed their bodies. At Elmina, in what's now Ghana, a Dutch traveler observed, quote, several hundred boys and girls sporting together before the beach and in many places among the rolling and breaking waves, learning to swim and surf, concluding that African dexterities proceed from being brought up, both men and women from their infancy to swim like fish, end quote. While this talk does not have time to consider surfing and the numerous types of dugout canoes that Atlantic Africans created, I want to digress for a moment to explain how Atlantic Africans are the only known people to harness waves energy as part of their daily productive labor. Atlantic Africa has few natural harbors. Thus, the only way to reach offshore fisheries and shipping lanes was in specially designed surf canoes that were capable of surfing waves, and surfports that were constructed to provide the same function as seaports, but required mariners to cross through surf to reach the open ocean. Sources suggest that African youth used surfing to develop the sophisticated understandings of hydrography, which many of you will know is underwater geography and how it informed navigation, and surf zones necessary to ride waves up to 8 feet tall in surf canoes that were loaded with tons of perishable commodities. People from Senegal to South Africa and as far inland as Mali believed in deities. Here's a few images of surf canoes that were half woman, half fish, with Mamiwata being the most celebrated of these finned deities. Shape-shifting between a woman, half fish, Mamiwata slipped between discrete elements and circumstances, water and earth, the real and surreal, the present and the future. She safeguarded followers from drowning and rewarded them with enhanced spiritual understandings, good health, and success. Most closely associated with the Yoruba of Nigeria and Benin, followers carried her to the Americas by the early 1700s. There, Mamiwata and other aquatic deities continue to safeguard enslaved swimmers, fishers, and canoeists. Aquatics were not strictly secular activities. Canoes and Africans' wet bodies enabled individuals and societies to forge bonds with ancestral and spiritual deities. Communicating with ancestors and spirits was part of daily life, with water being a catalyst to do so. Thus, churning the muddy waters of broad rivers with one's limbs, suspending one's body in the Atlantic brine, surfing a wave, or skimming across surfaces in dugouts permitted Africans to intimately connect with sacred waters, aquatic deities, and ancestral spirits. The Atlantic slave trade and New World slavery disrupted Africans' relationship with water and wood. Indeed, slavery redefined relationships that Africans' bodies had with waters, transforming waterscapes in many instances into scenes of subjection and dugouts into vehicles of subjugation, with enslaved canoemen being forced to transport slave-produced cash crops to seaports, paddling back to plantations bearing the African humanity that had just been disgorged from slave ships' hulls. Regardless, in the Americas, enslaved Africans were remarkably successful at recreating and reimagining maritime traditions. The Atlantic slave trade channeled Atlantic Africans and their traditions to the Americas. Most slaveholdings were built along navigable waterways to facilitate the shipment of slave-produced cash crops to market, providing captives with semi-tropical and tropical waterscapes that were familiar to the ones they had been stolen from. Valuing the African knowledge and wisdom that members of particular ethnic groups possessed, enslavers sought out and clustered captives into ethnic enclaves, making it easier for people to recreate African traditions. And these images show some of the traditions that enslavers wanted captives to bring to the Americas. Among them was underwater diving, employing enslaved Africans as salvage divers, as pearl divers, as conch divers, and in other capacities. And then here's some other traditions. They also employed them as fishermen and as fisherwomen. In the Americas, enslaved Africans infused waterscapes that still possessed American Indian valuations with African spiritual beliefs, populating them with African deities. After working for enslavers for most of the day, captives slipped into coastal waters and rivers to cool off, soothe aching muscles, and wash away the dirt of plantation slavery. During their free time, the enslaved harvested shellfish and fish to augment their meager rations. Fathers and sons carved family canoes that mothers and daughters paddled to weekend seaports and riverport markets to sell seafood, produce and goods produced during their free time to white residents. Simultaneously, enslavers recognized that African aquatics could be profitably exploited, and as I mentioned, employing many captives to dive into the depths to harvest pearl oysters, conch, lobster, and sea turtles, and to salvage shipwrecks. By the waterside, enslaved canoe makers crafted African-style dugout canoes that enslaved canoemen, as I mentioned, used to ship the wealth of plantation slavery to seaports. Enslaved women used African marketing systems and maritime skills to provide most white seaport residents with the majority of their fresh seafood, fruit, vegetables, and vegetables, allowing enslaved women to earn money and set prices as they controlled seaport markets. Throughout Atlantic Africa, women monopolized daily and weekly markets, selling goods produced by themselves and male relatives. Enslaved women conveyed this practice to the Americas, where they monopolized seaport markets held each Saturday. And so importantly, while there were grocery stores, if you will, in many of the seaports throughout the American South, much of the fresh seafood, game, and fresh fruits and vegetables that people consumed were sold at what were very similar to today's kind of fishermen's markets, or farmers markets. And so enslaved women in the American South, and then also in the Caribbean, really came to dominate and to monopolize these markets. As in Africa, women used dugout canoes to ship the goods that enslaved men and that their enslaved husbands and themselves had produced, bringing with them an array of seafood, including sea turtle meat, eggs, shell and finned fish, whales, crocodiles, and manatee. From stalls and canoes along the waterfront, women sold food items, cooked dishes, and craft items, with one observer stating that the huckster's stall in Charleston, or from the huckster stall in Charleston, everything from, quote, a needle to an anchor may be purchased. As in Africa, family dugout canoes, and here's some images of markets. And so you can see some of them are these quite big, sophisticated markets. And then you can see goods were also sold from canoes, and women would walk about the streets selling goods from their heads, heading goods to sell them while carrying their children on their backs. As in Africa, family dugout canoes were both a means of production and a mode of conveyance, connecting women to networks of family, friends, and clients, while permitting female marketeers to travel upwards of 20 miles each direction while carrying large quantities of goods to market. Fleets of market-bound women became mobile marketplaces of information and places of important social interaction. As they drew together and disbanded on tidal rivers, coastal seas, and inter-island waters, canoe women living on different plantations from spouses, children, and friends linked up with loved ones, absorbing and radiating news and information. These fleets provided privacy for female vendors to engage in illicit conversations about freedom and derive price-fixing strategies that compelled white urban residents to pay higher prices for all female vendors' goods. Market voyages also enabled captives to extend family resources while bonding during their precious little free time. Mothers taught daughters how to handle canoes, providing life lessons, instructions on commercial negotiation, and how to navigate white authority. All the while, mothers and daughters knew they were responsible for enhancing their family members' material comfort. Female marketeers routinely sold goods from dugouts along the water, as I mentioned, with these positions permitting some to use canoes as bumboats, paddling out to newly arrived ships to conduct floating trade, as described in Bahia, Brazil. Quote, upon a vessel reaching the city, a scene of confusion ensues. Canoes pull off with market women to besiege the newly arrived. Large canoes filled with fowl are borne off to fortunate purchasers, as were bananas, oranges, and heaps of cabbage, yams, sugarcane, pumpkins, and melons, end quote. Dugouts linked marketeers to multiple social spaces, lining fresh and saltwater waterscapes, including slave quarters, gardens, churches, and markets, transforming what would have been otherwise discrete communities into communities of belonging. Rivers, swamps, and coastal and inter-island waters were woven into long tapestries of cultural environments. Canoes allowed women to travel broadly, maintaining connections, again, as I mentioned, with family members and friends who had been forcibly separated from them by sail. Even while retaining African cultural and spiritual meanings, dugouts were central in the creation of an African American cultural identity, as captives from diverse ethnic groups blended traditions while adopting European customs, including Christianity. Throughout the American South, waterways typically stood between slave quarters, which are the slave quarters are the communities that enslaved people lived in, and churches, compelling captives to travel to Christian services in African-style dugout canoes. In Georgia, flotillas carried parishioners to the preachings of Reverend Andrew Bryan. In 1773, Bryan, a former slave, founded the Bryan African Baptist Church, which was the first Baptist church in America, in North America, which later became known as the First African Baptist Church of Savannah. Late 18th century captives from, quote, rice and indigo plantations along the Savannah River were permitted to attend these preachings and came in numbers of Cypress log dugouts, paddling down and up the river on the Sabbath morning and in the evening, end quote. Thus, canoes that still possessed African spiritual meanings were central in conversion experiences. Bryan founded his church during the Great Awakening, which inspired many African-born captives to add Christianity to their spiritual beliefs. In 1790, he and approximately 500 followers, he had, approximately 500 followers, most of whom were enslaved. On Sundays, low-country waterscapes were thick with church-going dugouts, as I mentioned. These early converts did not abandon traditional beliefs, but instead layered Christianity onto African understandings. For instance, silk cottonwood trees are tropical and thus did not grow in the American South. Thus, captives there transferred spiritual beliefs from cottonwood trees onto cypress and bald cypress trees, which were ideally suited for crafting dugout canoes. Thus, these cypress canoes that captives were paddling, they retained these elements of African spiritual beliefs in them. The Great Awakening attempted to redefine social landscapes according to Christian traditions, yet Christianity did not convert waterscapes and church-going dugouts, nor should these fleets be used to qualify captives' Christian fervor. Up through the late 18th century, conversions did not demarcate the abandonment of African beliefs. And so what ends up happening, importantly, is that into the early 1800s, enslaved Africans, they end up retaining both African beliefs while converting to Christianity. So as fleets of women and men traveled to Christian services, they paddled to the African rhythms of canoemen's call and response songs. After services, many gathered to eat African-informed seafood dishes like gumbo, jambalaya, and pepper pot, filling their nostrils with the aromas of Africa and their mouths with the flavor and textures of past lives. After communal meals, many partook in a communal swim, allowing them to enjoy their exploited bodies while reaffirming communal bonds. For many, canoeing to and from church seemingly arranged waterways into cultural scapes that retain the sights, sounds, smells, and feelings and flavors of Africa, even as they created this African-American culture that increasingly saw Christianity as an important element of these traditions. Conversion routinely synthesized beliefs. The Protestantism introduced to American captives tended to be rigid and inflexible, hostile to the kinds of associations between African deities and Christian saints founded in a number of Catholic societies in the United States. Beyond white gaze, though, captives were free to Africanize Protestant religion experiences, thus engaging in reinterpretations and truth synthesis. For many, canoeing, and perceptions of waterways probably informed this process of reinterpretation as they synthesized African and Christian spiritual beliefs. White, and to a lesser extent, Black missionaries attempted to persuade free and enslaved Black people born in Africa and the Americas to renounce African spiritual beliefs. For example, beginning in 1784, Baptist missionary George Liele attempted to convert Jamaican captives to Christianity. Liele had been enslaved in Georgia and assisted his protege, George Bryan, in establishing the First Baptist Church of Savannah before immigrating to Jamaica. Liele moved to Jamaica in 1783 and established the first African Baptist Church of Kingston. He quickly attracted a sizable following and recognized that most of his followers retained African spiritual beliefs. For instance, Liele urged African-born captives to abandon beliefs regarding silk cottonwood trees as being sacred, while discouraged converts from holding Baptist meetings beneath their canopies, as they remained sacred African spaces. Still, Black Jamaicans retained spiritual beliefs regarding silk cottonwood trees, dugouts, and the sea. into the 20th century. And an example of that is this image here of Cujo, who was a Jamaican captive and a rebellious slave. Cujo was, as the description indicates here, from what's now Ghana. He was a member of the Akan ethnic group. And he was a Maroon leader, and Maroons were these rebel leaders. And in Jamaica, the English ended up allowing 3 groups of Maroons to obtain their freedom and autonomy. And so while the English used the Bible, swore upon the Bible to kind of sanctify this treaty, the Jamaican Maroons, who were members of the Akan ethnic language group, met under silk cottonwood trees as a way of sanctifying and spiritualizing these treaties. And so I want to end here, actually. And I know Robert has some follow-up questions that will kind of help us transition from kind of the talk that I had that explains these rich maritime traditions to coming to the present, where we might not think of African Americans as having this rich maritime history.
Right. Thank you so much, Kevin. That was very, very interesting and rich with a lot of detail and so forth. I think that, excuse me, we get the overarching point that you have, that you made. At least what came through to me was that because of this rich and native connection to water by way of, and the African sensibility that water, even though real and present and functional, had a transcendent reality associated with it, that of which they were a part. And so their identity, their self-worth, their respect for themselves, their respect for deity and transcendent reality, as well as the water itself, was very strong and could not be supplanted once they came to across the Atlantic as enslaved people, but remained resilient. As you said, part of the experience, our early experience in the Americas, is a testament to resiliency. And it seems as though there's a very strong through line to our relationship with water, even the clever uses by women, like you mentioned at first, of being able to distort their own image and sexual parts, and even have some privacy in water, despite the fact that water's translucent, so you can see through it. So that was quite amazing thing. As you said, we want to transition and come forward. Let me first tell those who are watching at this point, if you, in fact, you have questions, and we hope that you do, please write them in the chat or whatever mechanism that is available to you, and our dialogue coordinators will alert me, and they will read the questions from the dialogue room, and Kevin will answer them. But I'm going to start us off by asking just a very broad question. Clearly, the history and the connection is very, very, very deep in terms of Africans and water. You note in your book, as you did in your lecture just now, that the longest coastline of any continent is African. And so almost inherently, Africans are people of the water. But in modern day North America, and perhaps even in other parts of the world, Black people are not associated with water. And as a matter of fact, there are malintentioned and uninformed statements about Black people not being buoyant or facile with water at all. In your opinion, what happened? Because yet I think we understand the obstruction and blockades and barriers and so forth. But what happened to us that we, to some extent, bought that?
Yeah, so I mean, you do raise. I mean, that's an important point. I mean, the one thing I would add, though, I mean, to the coastline, right? I mean, because it's this long. Africa has this long coastline. But one thing I think that's oftentimes overlooked or that we forget about also is that that you have these huge rivers in Africa that are much bigger than, say, the Mississippi. I mean, if you go to the Mississippi and then you go to the Gambia River or the Senegal River or the Congo, I mean, these rivers just dwarf the Mississippi as far as their width and in some instances their length. I mean, we're talking about rivers that are 8-10 miles wide. And so these are very big waterways that provide, and they could be tidal. The ocean's tide is informing them up to 100 miles. Some of these rivers up to 100 miles inland, and so these are also provided many African peoples, as far inland as Timbuktu, right, almost 1,000 miles inland, with maritime experiences in the desert, basically. So yeah. So I think that's important to note as well. So the thing I think that has discouraged African Americans from swimming is, I mean, there's a few things I think that have discouraged African Americans and then also peoples in the Caribbean from swimming, but particularly African Americans. And some of it is technology. So if you jump back, and I didn't talk about this, but in depth anyway, I mentioned it, but you had enslaved people free diving, swimming, diving down with only the air in their lungs to harvest shellfish to salvage goods. And during the early modern period, which goes up until about 1840s or so, free diving was much more efficient than any other technique. It's much more efficient than a diving bell. And it's in like the 1840s that you get the first diving helmets, crude as they were, and they don't become much more developed until the kind of the late 1800s. And so as diving helmets became more popular and more widely used, this allowed non-swimming people of European descent to begin to dive down, if you will, and walk around the bottom. Now, I should also mention that most white people at this time had largely stopped swimming. I mean, in the Middle Ages, Europeans stopped swimming for a number of reasons, largely stopped swimming for a number of reasons. One is most people swam nude, and the Catholic Church saw that as being immoral, and so they discouraged swimming. But they also doctors believed that the plagues that were ravaging Europe were caused because water was seeping into one's body and disrupting what was known as the four humors. And the four humors is this theory that the body is made up of solid, cold, or liquid, solid, heat, and cold. And so if one immersed themselves in water, they would have too much water in their body and they would get sick. And we still hear this, right? Like, don't go out in the rain, or you might get sick if you get your feet wet. I mean, it's kind of the legacy of this. If you get your feet wet, you might get sick. And this is why European doctors bled people or put leeches on people, because they felt they had too much liquid in them and they should drain that off. And so for these reasons, Europeans largely stopped swimming. Africans didn't have these beliefs, and so they continued to swim. And so what ends up happening then is, again, in the kind of the late 1800s, as technology is allowing white people to put on diving helmets and diving suits, they begin to displace Black people as, say, conch divers, as sponge divers, and things like that. But in the United States, unfortunately, what really kind of drove African Americans off of waterways was the emergence of Jim Crow racism, where Black people had been recreating, as I alluded to in the talk, along waterways. They were places where Black people would go on the weekend, natural waterways, and cool off. And in the 1880s, 1890s, you had the rise of beach culture. And so white Americans began to drive African Americans off of beaches, whether they were coastal beaches, in the Carolinas, in Georgia and Florida, or rivers in the heartland of the Deep South, or even up in Chicago. I mean, the race riot, the 1919 race riot in Chicago happened when a young Black man accidentally drifted from a black beach into a white beach on an inner tube. That riot erupted as a result of that. And so as racial violence was used to drive African Americans off of desirable beaches, they became less desirable then for African Americans, or water as a whole became a less desirable place for Black Americans to recreate. Also, the bodies of lynching victims were oftentimes deposited into rivers and lakes, and this ends up discouraging African Americans from swimming in those lakes. I mean, Emmett Till being kind of the most famous example of that, but you have this happening throughout the American South and in New England and in the kind of the Midwest as well. And then another thing that discouraged African Americans from swimming is that swimming pools had been first introduced in the United States in the 1880s as a way for urban people to basically bathe themselves. And so swimming pools in the 1880s into the early 1900s were gender segregated. So you had pools for men, pools for women. And then kind of around World War I, white families began to say, we should recreate at swimming pools as families. And so at that time, pools went from being gender segregated to being racially segregated. And as they were racially segregated, you might have one Black pool for every 20 white pools. And so this stopped creating spaces for African Americans to swim. And so you had then in the 20th century, African Americans becoming less and less proficient swimmers. And so then the drowning death rate among African Americans became disproportionately high. And so for decades now, the Center for Disease Control has labeled this drowning Black death rate as an epidemic. And so to jump back to the 1950s, people recognized, academics and doctors recognized that Black people were drowning at a much higher rate than white Americans. And they overlooked how racism contributed to that and looked for kind of quote unquote biological explanations. And so as you alluded to, Robert, this theory came up that Black people were less buoyant, that their bones were denser than people of European descent. And so this was causing this disproportionately high drowning death rate among African Americans. And this belief has persisted up into the 20th century, unfortunately.
Yes. You mentioned that, excuse me, some of the discouragement from swimming by Africans earlier in the 20th century, maybe, had to do with the misuse and misappropriation of the waters by white slaveholders and others in terms of throwing the bodies in and sort of polluting the water from its sacred and pure and powerful perspective that Native Africans had. So in a way, there is this sort of paradoxical understanding that Africans and African Americans have had with the water. Our section on African American maritime history within the Maritime Cultural Currents series is titled Passing Through the Waters. And that is taken from a Bible verse from the prophet Isaiah, which says, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they will not overwhelm you. And that is because we were aware of, in some ways, this sort of paradoxical relationship that we have with waters. These waters are the very same waters that allowed transport of Africans from their homelands to here, and all of the exploitation and so forth and so on. But at the same time, not overwhelmed because of the strength of the relationship with water, allowing the Africans to be resilient and to maintain and preserve some of their cultural identity, as well as allowing for Black employment and so forth in the New World. But an interesting aspect of that we are not very familiar with is the maritime dimension to the Underground Railroad. Talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, I think that's really important, is that so like, as you said, I mean, the water is this sacred space, and then it's the scene of subjugation. You know, and it's not just the water, but like the wood. So trees, I mean, when acts of racial violence were committed, oftentimes, I mean, enslavers understood that Africans regarded particular trees as sacred. And so they would when people would be lynched, they would be hanged from those trees. So in Jamaica, when Africans, Black people were lynched, they were oftentimes hanged from silk cottonwood trees. In the American South, the trees that end up taking on the same kind of spiritual meanings that silk cottonwood trees had, you know, African Americans were hanged from those trees. And so there was this conscious effort of kind of stripping the cultural value of wood and water from Africans and African Americans. And so regardless of that, though, this water and wood retained, as you said, these spiritual meanings. And they were ways of not just, I mean, the water wasn't just a way of, like, it wasn't just that Africans were crossing water to reach freedom the same way that they would cross land. There were spiritual meanings woven into that. And so what I mean by that is that, well, first of all, I mean, before I go into that, I should mention that, you know, we pay particular attention now to stories of or incidents of the Underground Railroad, you know, people crossing land, like Harriet Tubman, and she was a very important figure, and so I don't mean to diminish her accomplishments, but many more people escaped by water than by land. Many more people escaped in ships. You know, stowaways, freedom-loving white ship captains would stow away enslaved people. You know, a New England ship captain would stow away, you know, a few enslaved people when he would go down to trade in, say, Savannah or Charleston or New Orleans, and secret them off to freedom. And fishermen would do the same thing. But many more actually escaped. So you had significant numbers escaping aboard these ships, right? By these, you know, again, by these kind of freedom-loving captains facilitating that, and crew members facilitating their escape. But many, many more escaped, not as passengers aboard these ships, but as active participants by making dugout canoes out of cypress, out of silk cottonwood trees, and paddling to freedom, or swimming between islands, or swimming across rivers. I mean, the term Underground Railroad, actually, some people think that it came from this enslaved person who was being chased by an enslaver, jumps into the Ohio River, and the enslaver sees him jump into the river, and he goes underwater, and he says, well, I guess he's gone on the Underground Railroad. The man survived. I'm forgetting the man's name, but some people claim that that's where the term Underground Railroad comes from. Regardless, many more people escaped across water. And as Africans were crossing water, it wasn't just a secular voyage, it was a spiritual voyage as well. So they were evoking ancestors and water deities assistance to help them cross this water. And if they died in the passage, that didn't signify failure. It just meant that they reached freedom and communities of belonging in the next life, right? So Africans believed that life was cyclical. And so if they died, water facilitated this cyclical process, sped it up, and allowed them to be reborn in Africa. So you get large numbers of Africans in the 16 and 1700s, believe it or not, actually paddling out into the Atlantic, trying to reach freedom. I mean, their owners, there's accounts where they're going off and owners see them going off into the east, into the rising sun. Or they would go south, enslaved people in South Carolina and Georgia would flee to freedom in Spanish Florida. Or, after Florida became part of the United States, people would flee to the Bahamas or to Cuba, or Jamaicans would flee to Cuba. People were fleeing all over the place, oftentimes typically across imperial boundaries to find freedom in colonies where slavery had been abolished, or to try and pass themselves off as free Black people, in another colony. And so, you have large numbers of people, tens of thousands of enslaved people obtaining freedom in those ways.
That is really amazing, and again, a piece that we don't quite take note of as much as we should. We have come to the end of our time together. It has gone by really fast. This is a fascinating subject, and we have simply scratched the surface. We want to, first of all, thank Dr. Kevin Dawson for all of that information. I want to encourage everyone, Google him. He does have a couple of monographs that are available for public consumption. They're in the public domain, that are very well worth reading. And his book, Undercurrents of Power, Aquatic Culture in the African Diaspora, is a read that is very important and should be in everyone's library who cares about maritime and African American history. Let me encourage you to continue to be with us for these maritime culture currents. In particular, for African American history, we will be looking at other aspects, employment aspects. During the Civil War, there were more from the Revolutionary War to the Civil War, there were more African men employed on ships than actually on the farms. And that was an amazing thing, and the basis. And in a way, maritime became the basis for sort of the middle class of Americans in many communities, including in the Bay Area, working at the shipyards and as longshoremen and so forth and so on. One of our subsequent guests will be Willie Adams, who is the international president of the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, which employs lots of African Americans and so forth. I will note as we leave a bit of history, African American maritime history. May 13, 1862, an enslaved man named Robert Smalls, this is in the middle of the Civil War, commandeered a Confederate ship called the Planter. He brought his family and many other enslaved families and guided that ship through Confederate territory and delivered that ship to Union soldiers, and it became a Union warship. He subsequently became an elected representative in Congress from the state of South Carolina. So this is kind of fortuitous time. We're May 19th. This was on May 13th. May 19th also is the birth date of Malcolm X, if we'll remember, and May 18th in whatever year it was, 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson declared that separate but equal was constitutional. That was a 7-to-1 vote by the Supreme Court. May 18, in 1954, we had Brown v. Board of Education, which said that unanimously determined that separate but equal was unconstitutional. So this is a significant time for us to be talking about and adding to the discussion and discourse about African-American history and progress, and a reminder of the resiliency of African people because of the strength of water. And water connects us in ways that nothing else does. And so we thank you for joining us. Join us again on the Seafaring Channel for Maritime Culture Connections, brought to you by the International Maritime Center and the Seafarers Ministry of the Golden Gate. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Dawson.
Thank you for having me.
All right.